Is this some kind of joke? Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a smug grin creeping across his wrinkled face. His gavel rested lazily in his hand as he studied the two young people standing before him. The grand courtroom, filled with murmuring spectators, suddenly fell silent. The young black couple stood firm, their expressions unreadable. The man, tall with sharp eyes that gleamed with confidence, placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. She, petite but poised, stood with her head high, her hands calmly folded in front of her. Judge Reynolds scoffed, flipping through the legal documents they had submitted. "Let me get this straight," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "You two think you can walk into my courtroom and outsmart me? You don't even have a lawyer." He chuckled, shaking his head. "This is embarrassing." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The audience smirked, whispering amongst themselves. The young man didn't flinch. "We know exactly what we're doing, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "Oh, do you?" The judge mocked, his voice rising. "Well, then, let's see how long that lasts." He slammed his gavel down, his smirk widening. And then, something happened that left the entire courtroom frozen in shock. The woman beside him calmly stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Actually, Your Honor, we'd like to present a motion under," she paused, flipping open a book she had been holding. "Under subsection 5 of the Legal Fairness Act, which clearly states that." The judge's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, his smugness flickered. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The room fell into absolute silence. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The judge shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. The murmurs in the audience stopped. People leaned forward. The bailiff, usually expressionless, furrowed his brows. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, gripping the edge of his desk. "Excuse me," he muttered. The young woman didn't blink. "Would you like me to repeat myself?" she asked calmly. For the first time in his career, Judge Reynolds felt nervous. And nobody, not even him, saw it coming. The events leading to this moment had been brewing for weeks. It all started with a dream. Brian and Aaliyah Thompson had been married for just over a year. They were young, ambitious, and deeply in love. Brian was 27, sharp-witted, with a natural ability to pick things apart and put them back together in ways that left people amazed. Aaliyah, 25, was soft-spoken but had a mind like a steel trap. Once she learned something, she never forgot it. Life had not been easy for them. They had grown up in rough neighborhoods, where opportunities were scarce and the odds were stacked against them. But that never stopped them from believing in themselves. They had saved for years to start their own business, a small community center that would offer legal advice, financial literacy programs, and free tutoring for underprivileged kids. It was their way of giving back, of making sure the next generation wouldn't have to struggle the way they had. But then, disaster struck. One day, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a well-known real estate company, one that had been accused multiple times of shady dealings. The letter stated that the land their community center was built on was not legally theirs. According to the documents, the ownership had been transferred, without their knowledge, to a wealthy businessman who planned to demolish the center and build luxury apartments. Brian read the letter 3 times before he spoke. "This is a scam," he said. Aaliyah's heart pounded. "But the documents, they look official." "They want them to look official," Brian muttered, his jaw tightening. "They think we're too young, too inexperienced to fight back." Aaliyah swallowed hard. "Brian, we don't have the money for a lawyer." "We don't need one," Brian said firmly. He grabbed a thick law book from the shelf. "We'll learn the law ourselves." Aaliyah hesitated. "You mean we represent ourselves in court?" "Why not?" Brian grinned. "You always said you wanted to change the world. Let's start with this." And so they did. Day and night, they studied. They read every book they could find, watched legal videos, and practiced arguments against each other. They highlighted pages, scribbled notes, and prepared for battle. People laughed at them. Friends warned them. "You're going up against powerful people," they said. "You don't stand a chance." But Brian and Aaliyah refused to give up. They walked into the courtroom that day with nothing but their knowledge and determination. And now, standing before the judge, watching his arrogant smirk fade, they knew they had done the impossible. But just when it seemed like the tide was turning in their favor, something else happened. Something nobody expected. The doors of the courtroom suddenly burst open. A man in an expensive suit walked in, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. He was tall, his face unreadable, his presence demanding attention. The audience turned, whispering. The tension in the room grew thick. Judge Reynolds' eyes darted toward him, and then his face drained of color. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Brian tensed beside her. Who was this man? And why did the judge suddenly look like he had seen a ghost? The courtroom was silent. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something invisible had wrapped itself around the walls, holding its breath. The man in the expensive suit didn't say a word. He just stood there, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a predator surveying its prey. Judge Reynolds swallowed hard. His usual smugness had vanished, replaced by something else, something Brian and Aaliyah had never seen on his face before. Fear. Brian glanced at Aaliyah. He could feel the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the book she was holding. She had noticed it too. The man took slow, deliberate steps forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He reached the front of the courtroom, hands in his pockets, and looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Are we proceeding with this case or not?" Judge Reynolds hesitated. For the first time since Brian and Aaliyah had stepped into that courtroom, he looked unsure. His fingers drummed against the desk. "This is a small matter," the judge muttered, regaining some of his composure. "I don't see why someone of your position would be interested in it." The man smirked. "Oh, but I am interested." He turned his head slightly, his piercing gaze settling on Brian and Aaliyah. Brian clenched his jaw. Who was this guy? And why did he feel like he was here for them? Aaliyah spoke first. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the growing unease. "May we ask who you are?" The man turned to her, tilting his head slightly, as if assessing her. Then he smiled. "You can call me Mr. Blackwood." The name sent ripples of murmurs through the courtroom. Some people turned to whisper to each other. Others looked shocked, as if they couldn't believe this man was standing before them. Judge Reynolds shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Brian narrowed his eyes. The name wasn't familiar to him, but it was clear that everyone else in the room knew who this man was. Before Brian could ask another question, Blackwood turned his attention back to the judge. "I believe these two young people have presented a legal argument," he said, "and I believe you were about to dismiss it without consideration." Judge Reynolds opened his mouth, then shut it. His fingers curled around his gavel. "I run my courtroom, Blackwood," he muttered. Blackwood's smile didn't fade. "Then run it fairly." The tension in the room thickened. The audience was watching, their heads moving between Blackwood and the judge like spectators at a high-stakes game. Brian exchanged a glance with Aaliyah. They didn't know whether this man was an ally or another enemy. But one thing was clear. His presence had shaken the judge. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, a loud bang echoed through the courtroom. The doors swung open again. This time, a uniformed officer stormed in, his face red, his chest heaving as if he had run all the way here. "Your Honor," the officer called out, his voice urgent. "We have a problem." The judge's eyes snapped to him. "What now?" he barked, clearly irritated. The officer hesitated, glancing at the audience before lowering his voice. "It's about the case, sir," he said. "New evidence has just been uncovered." A hush fell over the room. Brian's heart pounded. New evidence? What did that mean? Aaliyah squeezed his hand. He could feel her pulse racing beneath her skin. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. "This case is already a waste of time," he muttered. "Just—" The officer stepped closer and whispered something into the judge's ear. Whatever he said made the judge freeze. His face went pale. His grip on his gavel loosened. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, in a voice that barely concealed his shock, Judge Reynolds cleared his throat and said, "Court will be in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel hit the desk. And just like that, the session was paused. Brian and Aaliyah exchanged glances. Something had just changed. Something big. The question was, were they about to find out the truth? Or were they about to be blindsided again? The courtroom erupted into murmurs the moment Judge Reynolds struck his gavel and called for recess. Spectators turned to one another, whispering in hushed voices. The officer who had stormed and disappeared through a side door, and Mr. Blackwood simply stood there, watching everything unfold with an expression Brian couldn't read. Aaliyah's grip on Brian's hand tightened. "What just happened?" she whispered. "I don't know," Brian muttered, scanning the room. But whatever that officer told the judge, it shook him. They watched as Judge Reynolds quickly gathered his papers, stood up, and stormed out through his private chamber. Brian clenched his jaw. Something's not right. Aaliyah tugged his sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. Should we follow? Before Brian could answer, Mr. Blackwood turned his head slightly and, as if sensing their thoughts, smirked. Patience, he murmured, loud enough for only them to hear. Aaliyah stiffened. Brian narrowed his eyes. Who are you? Blackwood's smirk deepened. Someone who doesn't like seeing the law twisted for personal gain. He adjusted his suit cuffs and took a step closer, lowering his voice. If I were you, I'd be ready. Things are about to get interesting. And then, before either of them could respond, he walked away. Brian watched him disappear through the same side door the officer had used. Aaliyah let out a slow breath. I don't trust him, she whispered. Me neither, Brian admitted. But he knows something. They sat down at the defendant's table, waiting as the murmurs in the courtroom swirled around them. Their minds raced. 15 minutes had never felt so long. Finally, the side door swung open, and Judge Reynolds stepped back inside. His face was tense. His usual smug confidence had not returned. But something was different. He sat down and cleared his throat, his fingers drumming against the bench. The court is now back in session. The murmurs died down instantly. Brian and Aaliyah straightened. Judge Reynolds inhaled deeply before speaking. It has come to my attention, he said slowly, that there have been developments in this case. Brian's heart pounded. New evidence has surfaced, the judge continued, that may impact the proceedings. He glanced briefly at Blackwood, who had returned to his seat, watching with an amused expression. Aaliyah frowned. What evidence? She asked, her voice firm. The judge didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the courtroom doors. Bring him in. The doors creaked open. And then, a man was led inside. His suit was expensive, his posture stiff, his face pinched with barely contained frustration. Brian sucked in a sharp breath. He recognized this man. So did Aaliyah. It was Robert Langston, the CEO of Langston Real Estate, the man trying to steal their community center. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The audience turned, whispering frantically. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses and laced his fingers together. Mr. Langston, he said, his voice calm but edged with something else. Do you know why you're here? Langston's jaw clenched. I assume it has something to do with the misunderstanding regarding the property. His voice was smooth, calculated. Brian felt his blood boil. Misunderstanding? Aaliyah beat him to it. You mean the fraud? She corrected sharply. Langston's eyes flicked to her, and for a brief moment, something cold flashed in them. Judge Reynolds ignored the exchange. He turned toward the bailiff. Present the documents. The bailiff stepped forward, holding a thick file. He handed it to the judge, who opened it, scanned the contents, then looked up. These are the real ownership documents, the judge announced. The tension in the room snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Brian's breath caught in his throat. The judge held up a page. This document here, he continued, proves that the transfer of ownership was forged. A sharp intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Langston's face twitched. He remained silent, his fingers curling slightly. Aaliyah blinked in shock. You mean, the property was never his? Judge Reynolds exhaled. That's what the evidence suggests. He placed the documents down and leaned forward. Which raises a very important question, Mr. Langston. Langston's expression darkened. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes. How do you explain this? A long silence followed. The room was thick with anticipation. Brian and Aaliyah could feel the shift. The tables had turned. But just when it seemed like Langston was cornered, he smirked. And then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, You have no proof I did anything wrong. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Reynolds blinked. Excuse me. Langston's smirk widened. He adjusted his tie. You found forged documents. Fine. But do you have any evidence linking me to them? Brian's stomach twisted. Aaliyah's eyes darted toward the judge. Judge Reynolds hesitated. And that was all Langston needed. Anyone could have forged those papers, he said smoothly. A disgruntled employee. A clerical error. Perhaps even someone trying to frame me. He leaned back, his confidence returning. Unless you have actual proof tying me to this, I suggest you drop this nonsense. The smugness in his voice sent a shiver down Aaliyah's spine. Brian clenched his fists. He knew Langston was lying. They all knew. But in a courtroom, knowing wasn't enough. You had to prove it. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply. He looked down at the documents, his frustration barely concealed. He wanted to press further. But Langston was right. Without direct evidence, they had nothing. Brian felt a wave of helplessness crash over him. Langston was slipping through their fingers. Again. Then, Aaliyah suddenly stood up. All eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath. And then, in a voice clear and unwavering, she said, "Actually, Your Honor, we do have proof." Brian's heart stopped. Langston's smirk faltered. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Aaliyah nodded. "Yes." And then, she reached into her bag and pulled out something that made Langston's face go completely white. The entire courtroom held its breath. Brian's eyes widened as he stared at what she was holding. This was it. The proof they needed. And the moment that would change everything. Aaliyah's hand was steady as she held up the small, black USB drive for the entire courtroom to see. Langston's smirk vanished. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What is that?" Aaliyah glanced at Brian, who was just as stunned as everyone else. He hadn't even known she had this. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this USB drive contains an audio recording, a conversation that directly links Mr. Langston to the forged documents." The entire courtroom erupted into gasps. Langston shot to his feet. "That's ridiculous," he barked. "There is no such recording." Aaliyah didn't blink. "Would you like to hear it?" Silence. Langston's face twitched. His hands balled into fists, but he quickly forced himself to regain composure. Judge Reynolds turned to Aaliyah, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Where did you get this?" Aaliyah's voice remained firm. "From one of Mr. Langston's former employees. A secretary who worked for him for over 10 years. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Reynolds held out his hand. "Hand it over." Aaliyah walked forward and placed the USB into the bailiff's hand. The bailiff took it to the court clerk, who inserted it into a laptop connected to the courtroom speaker system. The moment the file was pulled up, Judge Reynolds lifted his hand. Silence in the courtroom. A click. And then, a grainy voice filled the room. It was unmistakably Robert Langston's voice. "I don't care how you do it, just get it done." A pause. Then another voice, lower, hesitant. "Sir, this is illegal. If someone finds out." Langston's voice cut in sharply. "No one will find out. The Thompsons don't have the money to fight this. By the time they realize what's happened, their community center will be gone." The courtroom exploded. People gasped. Some whispered furiously to each other. Others shook their heads in disgust. Langston's face turned a shade of ashen white. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Reynolds's eyes burned into him. "Mr. Langston," he said slowly, his voice laced with something dangerous. "Would you care to explain this?" Langston panicked. This could be fake. Audio can be manipulated. This is..." Aaliyah was ready. "Actually, Your Honor, we had the recording verified by an audio forensics expert." She handed over another document. "This report confirms that the voice in the recording is 100% authentic." Judge Reynolds took the document, read through it, and then, slam. The sound of his gavel striking the desk echoed through the courtroom. "That's enough." His voice was sharp, final. "Mr. Langston, I strongly advise you to think very carefully about your next words." Langston was cornered. He had no way out. The evidence was damning. Brian felt his heart racing. Could this be it? Were they about to win? Then, Langston did something no one expected. He turned to Judge Reynolds, took a deep breath, and suddenly smiled. Aaliyah stiffened. Brian's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Langston adjusted his tie and let out a low chuckle. "Well, it looks like you got me." The judge frowned. "What are you saying?" Langston lifted his hands in mock surrender. "I'll admit, I might have pushed some paperwork around. Made a few adjustments." He exhaled dramatically. "Fine. You want me to confess? Here it is. I forged the documents." Gasps filled the room. Brian narrowed his eyes. "Why is he admitting it so easily?" he whispered to Aaliyah. Aaliyah was tense. "Because he's not done." Langston sighed and leaned forward. "But let me ask you something, Your Honor." He smirked. "Isn't forgery just a minor offense?" Judge Reynolds's expression darkened. Langston continued. "I mean, sure, I did something wrong, but let's be honest here. People get off with a slap on the wrist for stuff like this all the time." Brian's blood boiled. Langston was playing the system. He knew that wealth and power had protected men like him before. And now, he was betting on it happening again. Brian shot to his feet. You stole from a community, from people who had nothing, and you think you can just walk away? Langston smirked at him. It's just business, kid. Aaliyah's hands shook. You ruined lives. Langston shrugged. And what do you think is going to happen? That they'll throw me in jail? I have connections. I have money. You really think I'll see a single day behind bars? The arrogance in his voice was sickening. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply. He hated what Langston was implying. That men like him always found a way to escape justice. The judge turned to the prosecutor. What's the maximum sentence for forgery in this state? The prosecutor adjusted his glasses. In cases of this magnitude, up to 10 years in prison. Langston laughed. Please, I'll be out in 2. Aaliyah felt rage bubbling in her chest. Was that it? After everything, after all the suffering he caused, was he really just going to walk away? Then, a new voice spoke up. Actually, Your Honor, I'd like to add something. Every head turned. It was Mr. Blackwood. He stood up, adjusting his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. Judge Reynolds eyed him. And what would that be? Blackwood stepped forward, his sharp gaze piercing. I believe Mr. Langston is forgetting something very important. He turned, meeting Langston's eyes. Forgery might get you a reduced sentence. But what happens when we connect the dots and add fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy into the mix? Langston's smirk vanished. Blackwood pulled out a thick folder and handed it to the judge. This contains financial records, shell company transactions, and offshore accounts, all linked to Langston. The room froze. Judge Reynolds flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every word. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Langston, he said, his voice like steel. Langston swallowed hard. Judge Reynolds's next words sent a chill through the courtroom. You're not going home today. Slam. The gavel came down. And this time, Langston knew. He had lost. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Murmurs turned into full-blown whispers. People gasped, turned to each other, eyes wide in shock. The powerful Robert Langston, the man who had smirked, taunted, and manipulated the system, was now trapped. Brian could hardly believe what he had just heard. His breath caught in his throat. He looked over at Aaliyah, whose lips were slightly parted, her eyes locked on Langston. Langston, who only moments ago had been arrogant and sure of himself, was no longer smirking. His jaw was tight, his fingers curling against the table. His once perfect composure had cracked. Judge Reynolds was still flipping through the thick file that Blackwood had handed him. The further he read, the deeper his frown became. Finally, he exhaled sharply and snapped the folder shut. This is serious. Langston forced a chuckle, though his voice wavered. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. That man, he pointed at Blackwood, is clearly trying to sabotage me. I don't even know who he is. Where is this evidence coming from? Blackwood smiled coolly. Oh, you know exactly who I am. Langston's face twitched. Judge Reynolds waved his hand. Enough. Mr. Blackwood, can you confirm the authenticity of these documents? Blackwood gave a small nod. I can. And more importantly, Your Honor, so can the federal investigators who are on their way here right now. Another shockwave hit the courtroom. Brian felt Aaliyah grip his arm. Federal investigators? Langston's face drained of color. His voice cracked. You got the feds involved? Blackwood's smirk returned. I did. Langston stumbled back a step. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. This wasn't just some local courtroom problem anymore. This was federal, and that meant real prison time. Judge Reynolds rubbed his temples before fixing Langston with a steely gaze. Mr. Langston, do you have any response to these accusations before I make my ruling? Langston looked like a cornered animal. His hands clenched at his sides. His expensive suit, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a cage trapping him in place. The judge waited. The entire courtroom waited. Langston's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his entire career, he had nothing to say. Judge Reynolds gave a firm nod. In that case, the courtroom doors burst open. A team of federal agents stormed inside. Their suits were crisp, their expressions unreadable. The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a warrant. Robert Langston, he said, his voice steady but firm. You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Gasps filled the room. Langston snapped. No, I'm too powerful for this. You can't do this to me. The agents didn't even blink. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Langston thrashed. You don't know who you're messing with. I'll have you all fired. Do you hear me? I own this city. The agent ignored him. He grabbed Langston's arms and pulled them behind his back. Click. The handcuffs locked into place. Langston froze. Brian and Aaliyah watched in stunned silence as the man who had nearly destroyed their future, the man who had mocked them, underestimated them, laughed at them, was dragged away like a criminal. Because that's exactly what he was. As he was pulled past them, his eyes locked onto Brian and Aaliyah. There was no longer arrogance in them. Only pure, seething hatred. This isn't over, he hissed through clenched teeth. Brian met his gaze without flinching. Oh, it's over, Langston, he said, his voice calm but deadly serious. And we won. Langston's face twisted into fury. But he couldn't do a thing. The agents dragged him away. The moment the doors closed behind them, the entire courtroom erupted into cheers. People clapped, some even whistled. It wasn't just about Brian and Aaliyah anymore. This was justice for everyone Langston had hurt. Aaliyah turned to Brian, her eyes shining with emotion. We did it. Brian let out a breathless laugh. Yeah, he whispered. We really did. Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel down, calling for silence, though there was a small smile on his face. This court officially rules in favor of the Thompsons, he declared. The property in question remains rightfully theirs. Court is adjourned. He slammed the gavel one last time. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, that's what they thought. Because as Brian and Aaliyah walked out of that courtroom, basking in their victory, feeling lighter than they had in weeks, a man stepped out of the shadows. A man they didn't recognize. A man who had been watching everything. He smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that promised one thing. A storm was coming. Brian felt a rush of relief as he and Aaliyah stepped outside the courthouse, the warm sunlight washing over them. For the first time in weeks, they could breathe. They had fought. They had won. Langston was gone. The community center was saved, and justice had been served. But even as the crowd outside cheered for them, neighbors, supporters, even reporters shouting questions, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that someone was watching them. He glanced over his shoulder. A tall man stood in the distance, dressed in a dark suit, his posture too relaxed, his eyes locked directly on them. Brian's stomach twisted. Aaliyah, he murmured. She turned, following his gaze. The moment she saw the man, her fingers curled around Brian's wrist. Who was that? Brian didn't know. But every instinct in him screamed that this man wasn't just a bystander. Before Brian could react, a group of reporters swarmed them. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to defeat one of the most powerful real estate moguls in the city? Did you always believe you'd win? What's next for the two of you? Aaliyah squeezed Brian's hand. He knew she didn't love being in the spotlight, but she held her head high. We didn't do this just for ourselves, she said firmly. We did this for every small business, every family that's been taken advantage of. Justice was served today, but there are so many others still fighting. Brian nodded. And we're not stopping here. The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, voices blended into a blur. And then Brian's eyes snapped back to the man in the suit. He was gone. A chill ran down his spine. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure they were ready. 1 week later, the community center had never been busier. People poured in, some offering congratulations, others asking for help. Brian and Aaliyah had become symbols of something bigger. Aaliyah sat at the front desk, flipping through legal forms, when Brian walked up. Hey, he said, leaning against the counter. You holding up? She exhaled, rubbing her forehead. We've had 6 new cases come in today. Landlords evicting people unfairly, businesses getting shut down with no explanation. It's like Langston was just one piece of something bigger. Brian frowned. You think someone else is pulling the strings? Before Aaliyah could answer, the front doors swung open. A man stepped inside. Brian froze. It was him, the man from the courthouse. Up close, he looked even more imposing. Late 40s, salt and pepper hair, cold calculating eyes. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, he said smoothly, stepping forward. My name is Richard Davenport. I think we need to talk. Aaliyah's hand tightened around the desk. About what? Davenport slid a business card across the counter. I represent certain interests in this city. Let's just say, people who weren't too happy about what happened in court last week. Brian's jaw locked. Davenport chuckled at his reaction. Relax. I'm not here to threaten you. A beat of silence. Then he added, I'm here to offer you a deal. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. A deal? Davenport nodded. You're smart. You proved that in court. And you made some very powerful people angry. He leaned forward. But anger isn't always bad. Sometimes it's an opportunity. Brian narrowed his eyes. Cut to the chase. Davenport's smirk widened. I want you to work for us. Aaliyah went rigid. Us. Davenport didn't blink. A group of very powerful men and women. People who control this city in ways you can't imagine. Brian felt like ice was spreading through his veins. Davenport continued, his voice calm, dangerous. You two have potential. The way you handled Langston? That was impressive. We could use minds like yours. And trust me, he tapped the desk, voice dropping lower. It's better to be with us than against us. Silence stretched. Aaliyah's fingers dug into the desk. And what happens if we say no? Davenport smiled. But this time, it was empty. You won't. Then, he turned and walked out. Brian and Aaliyah didn't move, didn't breathe, because they both knew something terrifying had just happened. They had won the battle, but they had just stepped onto a battlefield far bigger than they had ever imagined. And this time, the enemy wasn't just one corrupt businessman. It was something much bigger, something that didn't lose, something that didn't forgive. And now, it had its eyes on them. Brian slammed the door to their apartment, his hands shaking as he paced back and forth. This is bad, he muttered. This is really, really bad. Aaliyah sat on the couch, her arms folded tightly over her chest. She was trying to process everything. Davenport, the deal, the warning. She had thought Robert Langston was the enemy. But this was something else entirely. Brian, she said carefully, he wasn't just offering us a deal. He was letting us know that they see us now. Brian ran a hand over his face. We were so focused on Langston, we never thought about the people above him, the ones pulling the strings. Aaliyah nodded, her mind racing. They own this city, Brian. They own the system. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And they don't lose. Silence stretched between them. Then Brian spoke, his voice low, certain. We're not taking that deal. Aaliyah didn't hesitate. No, we're not. Brian sat down next to her, exhaling sharply. So what do we do? If we say no, they'll come after us. Aaliyah chewed her lip, thinking, maybe we don't just say no. Brian frowned. What do you mean? She looked at him, her eyes sharp with determination. I mean, we don't just turn them down. We expose them. Brian blinked. You want to go to war with the most powerful people in the city? Aaliyah's jaw tightened. They're already at war with us, Brian. We just didn't know it. A beat of silence. Then Brian slowly nodded. Okay, he said, voice firm. Let's take them down. The next day, Brian and Aaliyah sat in their community center, the blinds drawn, their laptop screens glowing in the dim light. They had spent the entire night digging. Davenport had been careful. Too careful. No public scandals. No criminal record. Just an endless list of expensive properties, high-end business connections, and corporate investments that led nowhere. But Aaliyah had a gift. She had spent years researching legal loopholes and financial tricks, and she knew how to read between the lines. And finally, she found something. A company. A shell corporation, buried under layers of fake owners and redirected funds. Brian leaned over her shoulder. Blackridge Holdings? Aaliyah nodded, clicking through the files. It's a dummy company, Brian. It doesn't do anything. No employees, no actual services. It just moves money around. Brian frowned. Whose money? Aaliyah clicked one more time. And there it was. Names. Familiar names. Powerful names. Brian's stomach dropped. It's them, he whispered. The names weren't just business executives. They weren't just politicians. They were judges, police chiefs, city officials, people who were supposed to enforce the law, not break it. And at the top of that list? Richard Davenport. Aaliyah stared at the screen. This is what they're protecting. Brian sat back, his mind reeling. If we expose this. Aaliyah finished his thought. We destroy them. Brian's heart pounded. They had found something big. Bigger than Langston. Bigger than anything they had ever imagined. But just as he was about to suggest their next move, the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. Aaliyah inhaled sharply. Brian. A sudden crash sounded outside. Brian's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Aaliyah's hand and pulled her down, keeping them low. Someone was outside. A silhouette moved past the window. Fast. Precise. Aaliyah's breath was shaky. They know. Brian's jaw clenched. Yeah. Then, The front door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Aaliyah's fingers dug into Brian's arm. "We have to go? Now." Brian nodded, already reaching for the back exit. But just as they moved, the front door burst open, and they ran. Brian and Aaliyah sprinted through the back exit, their hearts pounding. The air outside was thick with tension. The alley behind the community center was dimly lit, the flickering street lamp casting long shadows against the brick walls. Behind them, they heard the heavy footsteps of whoever had just broken in. Aaliyah gripped Brian's hand. "Keep moving." Brian didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the alley, weaving past trash bins and old crates. Whoever was after them wasn't far behind. Brian risked a glance over his shoulder. Two men, dressed in black. No badges. No uniforms. This wasn't the police. These men were sent by Davenport. Brian and Aaliyah rounded a corner, breathless, trying to think fast. "We need to get to the main street," Brian whispered. "If we get into the crowd." Bang! A gunshot rang out. Aaliyah gasped as the bullet hit the brick wall inches from her head. Brian swung around, grabbing her, pushing her behind a dumpster for cover. "They're shooting at us?" Aaliyah's eyes were wide. "Brian, we're not just exposing corruption anymore. We're in the middle of something bigger. They can't let us walk away." Brian clenched his fists. They weren't playing fair anymore. Another bang. A trash can exploded as the bullet ripped through it. "We have to keep moving," Brian said, scanning the alley. His mind raced. Then he spotted it. A fire escape leading up to the rooftops. He grabbed Aaliyah's wrist. "Up there." She didn't hesitate. She jumped onto the metal ladder, scrambling up as Brian followed close behind. The moment they reached the rooftop, Brian yanked the ladder up, stopping their pursuers from climbing after them. They took a second to breathe. Silence. Then, the men split up. One ran down the alley. The other turned back toward the street. Brian gritted his teeth. "They're trying to cut us off." Aaliyah's mind raced. "We need to lose them. Fast." Brian scanned the rooftops. "If we can make it to the next block, we can disappear into the crowd." Aaliyah nodded. "Let's go." They took off, jumping from rooftop to rooftop, their adrenaline pushing them forward. The city lights blurred beneath them. They were so close. Then, a black SUV screeched onto the street below. The back door swung open, and standing right there was Davenport. He was waiting for them. They had been trapped. Aaliyah skidded to a stop, breathing heavily. "Brian." Brian stared down at Davenport. The man stood with his hands in his pockets, calm as ever, like he had already won. Davenport tilted his head, smiling just slightly. "You two are making this a lot harder than it needs to be." Brian's fists tightened. "What do you want?" Davenport sighed. "I already told you. We like smart people on our side." His eyes darkened. "You? You're too smart for your own good." Aaliyah held Brian's arm, her voice quiet. "We can't let them take us." Brian knew she was right. If they got in that car, they wouldn't be walking away. Davenport lifted a hand, and the two men below pulled out their guns. Aaliyah gasped, but Brian didn't flinch. Davenport smirked. "Now, let's try this again. Are you coming with me? Or are we going to do this the hard way?" Brian's mind raced. They had seconds to act. And then, Aaliyah grabbed his hand. "I have an idea." She turned and ran straight for the edge of the roof. Brian's eyes widened. "Aaliyah," but before he could stop her, she jumped, right off the rooftop. Brian's heart stopped. Time seemed to slow as he watched Aaliyah disappear over the rooftop's edge. For a split second, the world went silent. Then, a loud crash echoed from below. Davenport's men rushed forward, their guns raised, peering over the edge. Brian didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He ran and jumped. Air rushed past him as he plunged down toward the alley below. At the last second, he hit a metal awning, rolling off and landing hard onto a stack of cardboard boxes. Pain shot through his back, but he didn't care, because right in front of him, Aaliyah was already moving. She had landed first, tumbling onto a pile of trash bags, already on her feet and running. Brian stumbled after her. Above them, Davenport's voice roared. "Go after them." The men scrambled down the fire escape, but it was too late. Brian and Aaliyah had hit the streets, and in the middle of the busy sidewalk, they vanished into the crowd. 10 minutes later, they didn't stop running until they reached a subway station. Aaliyah was breathless, gripping the railing as they ran down the steps. The station was packed, people rushing in all directions. Brian grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the platform. They blended in. Davenport's men wouldn't find them here. Not now. Not in this crowd. A train roared into the station, doors hissing open. They jumped inside just as the chimes sounded. The doors slammed shut. The train pulled away. And only then did they exhale. Aaliyah sank into one of the seats, her hands trembling. Brian sat beside her, his heart still hammering. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Brian turned to her, his voice low and stunned. "You jumped off a rooftop." Aaliyah let out a breathless laugh, still shaking. I didn't really have time to think about it." Brian stared at her. Then, despite everything, he grinned. "You're insane." She smiled back, but her eyes were serious. "We're not safe, Brian." His grin faded. She was right. Davenport's men had tried to kill them. That wasn't just a threat. That was a message. A message that said, "We see you. We own this city. You're not getting away." Brian exhaled. "We have to fight back." Aaliyah nodded. "And we have to do it now." 1 hour later, secret location. They didn't go home. Going home was too dangerous. Instead, Brian called the only person he could trust. And now, they were sitting inside a dimly lit garage, the sound of cars rumbling outside. Across from them sat Malcolm Green, a former investigative journalist turned whistleblower, a man who had once tried to expose corruption in the city, only to have his career destroyed by the same powerful people Brian and Aaliyah were now up against. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You're telling me you found a direct link between Davenport and a network of corruption?" Aaliyah nodded. "We have documents. Money trails. We were about to release it before they tried to kill us." Malcolm exhaled. "Yeah, that sounds like them." Brian clenched his fists. "We can't just run forever. We have evidence. We just need to find a way to make it public." Malcolm hesitated. Then, he pulled out his laptop. "I might have a way." Brian and Aaliyah leaned in. Malcolm's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. "Davenport's people control the local media. If you try to leak this through normal channels, they'll bury it before it ever reaches the public." Brian's jaw tightened. "Then how do we stop them?" Malcolm's lips curled into a mischievous grin. "We don't go local." He tapped the screen. And right there was the biggest independent news website in the country. An outlet that wasn't controlled by Davenport's network. An outlet that had millions of viewers. Aaliyah's eyes widened. "If we can get our story to them." Malcolm nodded. "It'll go everywhere." Brian's pulse raced. This was it. Their one shot. They could expose everything. But before they could celebrate, Malcolm's laptop pinged. Aaliyah frowned. What was that? Malcolm froze. Then, his face drained of color. Brian's stomach dropped. "Malcolm, what is it?" Malcolm turned the screen toward them. And there, on the screen, was a live security camera feed. A security camera feed of their exact location. Davenport had found them. Then, the garage lights flickered. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Brian shot to his feet. Because just outside, a car pulled up, and the doors opened. Davenport's men were here. And this time, they weren't leaving without them. Brian's pulse pounded in his ears. Outside the garage, multiple car doors slammed shut. The sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, approached. Aaliyah's fingers clawed at Brian's sleeve, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Brian, they're here." Malcolm's hands trembled as he slammed his laptop shut. "You guys need to move. Now." Brian gritted his teeth. They had seconds before those men busted in. Then, bang. A loud thump hit the garage door. Someone was trying to break in. Malcolm bolted toward a metal locker, yanking it open. "There's a back exit. Takes you through the warehouse behind us." He pulled out an old duffel bag and shoved it into Brian's hands. "Take this." Brian frowned, unzipping it, his eyes widened. Inside were burner phones, stacks of cash, and a loaded pistol. Brian snapped the bag shut. "What the hell, Malcolm? You were planning for war." Malcolm's face was dead serious. "Son, I've been fighting this war longer than you've been alive." Bang, bang. The door rattled violently. Aaliyah winced, gripping Brian's arm. Malcolm shoved them toward the back exit. "Go? I'll buy you time." Brian hesitated. "No, we're not leaving you." Malcolm shoved him harder. "I don't have a wife to protect." "You do." Brian's stomach twisted. Boom. The garage door burst open. A flash of movement. Men in suits, guns drawn. Brian grabbed Aaliyah's hand and ran. They sprinted through the back door, bursting into a dark warehouse filled with crates and metal shelving. The air was damp, thick with dust. Footsteps followed them, fast. Davenport's men were right behind them. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Brian. I know, he hissed, yanking her down a side aisle. They ran blindly, weaving through rows of stacked pallets, trying to stay ahead. Then, a gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past Brian's shoulder, shattering a crate beside him. Aaliyah screamed. Brian whipped around, fury in his veins. Enough running. He grabbed a wooden plank off a nearby stack and swung it hard. Crack. The first man dropped, hitting the floor with a groan. Brian grabbed his gun just as the second attacker lunged. Aaliyah reacted first. She grabbed a metal rod from the ground and swung it straight into the man's ribs. He stumbled back, gasping. Brian aimed the gun at him. Stay down. The man didn't move. Footsteps. More coming. Aaliyah yanked Brian's sleeve. We need to go now. Brian grabbed her hand, and they took off again. They burst through a side door and collided straight into Malcolm. His face was pale, his shirt slightly torn, but he was grinning. Took you long enough. Brian's eyes darted behind him. Where's the rest of them? Malcolm wiped his lip, smirking. Let's just say they won't be chasing us anytime soon. Aaliyah's eyes widened. Malcolm, what did you do? Malcolm just shrugged. Let's worry about that later. We gotta go. Minutes later, safe house. They arrived at a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Malcolm slammed the door behind them, locking every bolt. Brian finally exhaled. What now? Malcolm sat at the table, rubbing his temples. We need to get that evidence out. Now. Aaliyah nodded, still catching her breath. We were close, before they found us. Brian sat beside her. We're not going to get another shot like that. Malcolm pulled out his laptop. Then let's make it count. He opened a secure connection and typed rapidly. Minutes passed. Then, Aaliyah gasped. Look! On the laptop screen, a loading bar had appeared. The files were uploading. Brian's heart pounded. It's working. Malcolm grinned. Not just working. He turned the laptop toward them. And right there, on a major independent news site, was the headline. Breaking news. Massive corruption scandal linked to city officials, judges, and police chiefs. Aaliyah covered her mouth. Brian's stomach flipped. We did it. Malcolm leaned back, satisfied. Oh, we did more than that. Because not only had the files uploaded, they had gone viral. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. The story was everywhere. Davenport and his entire network, exposed. Then, Malcolm's phone buzzed. He answered, his face growing grim. Brian and Aaliyah watched him carefully. When Malcolm finally hung up, his face was serious. That was my contact at the news station. Brian's chest tightened, and Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. Davenport's gone. Aaliyah's breath hitched. What do you mean gone? Malcolm's eyes darkened. I mean he disappeared. No trace. No leads. It's like he never existed. Silence. Brian's stomach sank. Davenport was too powerful to go down quietly, which meant he wasn't done yet. And when he came back, it wouldn't be to negotiate. It would be for revenge. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the entire city was buzzing about the scandal. Judges, police chiefs, real estate moguls, Davenport's entire network were exposed. TV screens flashed with breaking news banners. Reporters stood outside government buildings as arrests were made. This was bigger than anyone had expected. Brian and Aaliyah watched from the safe house, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the television. They had done it. They had torn down the system that had tried to bury them. But Brian couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Davenport had vanished. And when powerful men disappeared, it only meant one thing. They were plotting their return. 2 days later, the safe house was quiet. Too quiet. Brian stood by the window, watching the streets below. Aaliyah sat on the couch, her laptop open, scrolling through updates. Malcolm was in the corner, cleaning a gun. Brian ran a hand over his face. I don't like this. Aaliyah glanced up. I know. They should have caught him by now. Malcolm snorted, not looking up. You think a guy like Davenport goes down that easy? He's got offshore accounts, backup plans. Hell, he probably had a private jet fueled and ready the second we leaked the files. Brian's stomach tightened. So what? He just disappears forever. Malcolm stopped, finally meeting Brian's gaze. No, his voice was serious. Men like him don't run. They wait. They rebuild. And then, Brian swallowed hard. Aaliyah's voice was quiet. They come back. Silence. Then, the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. Brian's muscles tensed. Aaliyah snapped her laptop shut. Malcolm grabbed his gun. They found us. Brian moved fast, pulling Aaliyah behind him as he reached for the duffel bag Malcolm had given them earlier. Aaliyah's breath hitched. What do we do? Malcolm peeked out the window. His jaw tightened. Black SUVs. 4 of them, blocking the entire street. And then, footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Getting closer. Brian's blood ran cold. Then, a single knock on the door. A deep voice. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. We need to talk. Aaliyah gripped Brian's arm. It's him. Brian felt his stomach twist. Davenport. He was back. And he had come for them. Inside the safe house. Malcolm gripped his gun tightly. We can't open that door. Brian nodded. If we do, we're dead. Aaliyah's mind raced. He wouldn't come alone. He's got men. And we don't have the firepower to fight back. Another knock. Then, Davenport's voice, calm but edged with warning. You have 5 seconds. Brian's breath hitched. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the back window. We could go out the back, but before he could finish, bang, the front door exploded inward. Gunfire erupted. Malcolm fired back, grabbing Brian and Aaliyah and shoving them toward the back exit. Run! Brian grabbed Aaliyah's hand and sprinted. Behind them, chaos erupted. Malcolm fired shot after shot, keeping the men pinned down. But there were too many of them. Brian knew Malcolm was buying them time. And then, silence. Brian's heart dropped. He turned, just in time to see Davenport step into the room, gun in hand. Malcolm was on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Davenport barely even looked at him. His eyes locked onto Brian and Aaliyah. And he smiled. Going somewhere. The final escape. Brian and Aaliyah bolted. They raced through the alley, their lungs burning. Behind them, Davenport's men poured out of the safe house, shouting orders. Brian's mind raced. They had no car. No escape plan. Aaliyah gritted her teeth. Subway. Brian snapped his gaze forward. The subway station entrance was just 2 blocks away. It was their only chance. They ran. Gunfire ripped through the night, bullets whizzing past them. They hit the station steps, raced down to the platform. A train was just arriving. Aaliyah yanked Brian forward. Come on. They jumped into the train just as the doors slammed shut. The train pulled away. And for the first time in hours, they were safe. Brian collapsed against the wall, breathless. Aaliyah sat beside him, shaking. Malcolm. Brian clenched his jaw. He saved us. Aaliyah wiped her eyes. We can't let it be for nothing. Brian exhaled sharply. We won't. She turned to him, her gaze steely. Then we finish this. Brian nodded. We bring Davenport down. Elsewhere. Davenport stood in the ruined safe house, his hands in his pockets. One of his men approached. They got away. Davenport didn't look angry. He just smirked. They can run all they want. He turned, stepping over Malcolm's lifeless body. But this isn't over. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. When the call connected, he spoke one sentence. Activate the contingency plan. Then he hung up and smiled. Because the next time he saw the Thompsons, he wouldn't just be chasing them. He'd be waiting. The train rumbled forward, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Brian and Aaliyah sat side by side, their bodies sore, their minds racing. They had escaped. For now. But they both knew this wasn't over. Davenport wasn't a man who lost. He was a man who waited. Aaliyah exhaled, staring at the dimly lit subway car. The few other passengers paid them no attention, just faces buried in their own worlds. Brian turned to her. We need to disappear. She nodded, already thinking ahead. No more using our real names. No digital trail. No credit cards. Brian clenched his fists. And then, she met his gaze, her eyes sharp. Determined. Then we come back stronger. Brian felt something ignite inside him. Davenport had everything, power, money, men. But Brian and Aaliyah had something stronger. The truth. And they weren't afraid to use it. 1 month later, Davenport sat in his high-rise office, gazing at the city skyline. The Thompsons had vanished. His men had searched everywhere, airports, bus stations, contacts, and law enforcement. Nothing. He smirked, swirling the drink in his glass. They're smart, he admitted. But not smart enough. Because no matter where they ran, he would find them. He always did. His phone buzzed. He answered. Speak. A voice on the other end hesitated. Sir, we have a problem. Davenport's smirk faded. What kind of problem? The man's voice dropped lower. It's the Thompsons. They're back. Davenport's grip on his glass tightened. Back? Already? That was impossible. He leaned forward. Where? A pause. Then, everywhere. Davenport's blood went cold. He turned toward his laptop, his eyes narrowing. And right there, flashing across the screen, was a news article. Not just one. Hundreds. Articles. Videos. Social media campaigns. All exposing him. His business deals. His bribes. His shell companies. And at the bottom of each report, a signature line. One he recognized immediately. The people deserve the truth, B&A. Brian and Aaliyah. Davenport's fingers curled into fists. They weren't hiding. They weren't running. They had declared war. And for the first time in his entire life, Davenport felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Somewhere in the city, Brian and Aaliyah stood in a small, dimly lit room, watching their plan unfold. The news had spread faster than they could have imagined. People were watching, listening, fighting back. Davenport was finished. Aaliyah looked at Brian, her voice quiet but strong. We did it. Brian wrapped an arm around her shoulders. No, he smiled. We just started. Because this wasn't just about them anymore. This was bigger than one case. Bigger than one corrupt man. This was about every single person who had been silenced, cheated, controlled. This was a movement. And they were just getting started. The city was changing. The same streets where Brian and Aaliyah once ran for their lives were now filled with people marching for justice. Their story had ignited something powerful, a movement that couldn't be silenced. Davenport had fled, his empire collapsing under the weight of his own corruption. Judges, police officials, business moguls, his entire network crumbled one by one. For years, men like him had ruled from the shadows, untouchable. Not anymore. Because the truth was out, and this time, the people were listening. 6 months later, Brian and Aaliyah walked through their newly reopened community center, the sound of laughter and conversation filling the air. The walls were covered with news articles, photographs of protests, framed newspaper clippings of their victory. Brian watched as a young woman, one of the people they had helped, stood in front of a small group, teaching them about tenant rights. Aaliyah smiled. Their mission had grown. They weren't just fighting corruption anymore. They were teaching others how to fight for themselves. Brian turned to Aaliyah, his heart full. We did it. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. No, she said, her voice soft but strong. We're still doing it. And as they stood there, in the very place they had once fought to protect, they knew one thing for sure. Their fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun.